Welcome everyone again to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This series is run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences of the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo. I'm the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, you can enter those in the Q&A box. You can enter those anytime you feel comfortable, but know that we do hold questions until the end, and we try our best to get to as many as possible, but it's often not possible for us to get to all of them. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet posted in the chat box shortly. Those of you that are pursuing APA continuing education credits will also keep an eye on the chat box, but near the latter portions of the presentation, about 45 minutes after the hour. That's when in the chat box, there'll be a link to a survey that you'll complete. Make sure that you bookmark or copy and paste that link before the webinar closes. And make sure you save your certificate after you complete the survey because we don't have copies of the completed surveys after the fact. The recording for this week's talk will be available in about a week or so, and PowerPoint slides for those that have registered for the series will also be available in about a week or so to those registered users as well. As a heads up, next week will be our final Law and Mental Health for 2024. We'll have Dr. Catherine Schaefer-McCouche, who'll be discussing risk assessment for intimate partner violence, stalking, and gang violence among adolescents. And then we return again for the first week of January 2025. But circling back to this week, I'm very excited to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing dimensional personality assessment in criminal legal settings. This is Dr. Jared Ruchensky. Dr. Jared Ruchensky is an assistant professor of psychology at Sam Houston State University. He completed his doctoral studies at Texas A&M University and his pre-doctoral clinical internship at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. His primary research interests focus on the assessment of personalities, pathology, including the alternative model for personality disorders, and commonly used instruments, particularly the personality assessment inventory. So Dr. Ruchensky, Jared, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, thank you so much for joining our series and sharing your expertise in personality assessment and the forensic applications of that with us today. I'll go ahead and toss it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is information for the CE credits regarding kind of getting those credits. In terms of disclosure, I have no financial benefits, I have no conflicts of interest to report, and then all the views that I express in this presentation are solely my own. All right, so for today, I kind of wanted to catch folks up to speed on the alternative model for personality disorders. So I'll kind of describe the basics of that model, and then hopefully give you kind of a solid, realistic assessment of where we're at with that model in the context of forensic and correctional settings. In particular, I'll try to identify some of the kind of major barriers I see to implementation, some potential solutions to navigating those barriers, and then also some suggestions for what kind of research we need in the future to make this model more feasible and more defensible. And at the end, I'll kind of walk through a sexually violent predator eval case. I do those evals quite regularly, and kind of how I think about implementing the AMPD in that line of work. All right, so opening question here is what and why is the AMPD? So, the past couple of decades, we've seen really a hard shift away from categorical models in the science literature, and focusing really more on unified dimensional personality pathology models. So historically, in terms of the PD field, we've had kind of discrete sets of folks studying discrete disorders. You have your psychopathy researchers over here, borderline researchers over here, narcissism researchers, and so on and so forth. And we've kind of developed this set of model and disorder specific literature that's kind of spread apart across these diagnoses. And really, in particular, in the past decade, we've really kind of rallied around studying unified models of personality pathology. So in terms of the DSM, I'm talking about the alternative model for personality disorders, and then the ICD-11 has its own dimensional model of PDs that I won't really touch on too much today. So really briefly, kind of why this pivot. And I think kind of to sum it all up is that categories just don't really neatly fit um, the complex clinical realities we face when we're actually working with people. And so kind of what I mean by that is, I don't know about you, but I very rarely worked with folks presenting with personality pathology and felt like they really cleanly and neatly and specifically fit one particular PD diagnosis. The research is pretty clear that most folks with one categorical PD diagnosis also qualify for another diagnosis. And so the reality is just that these categories just don't really seem to exist, and they don't really seem to match kind of the complexity that we see in the real world. And so really the overwhelming evidence at this point, and the field by and large is in agreement on this, is that personality pathology is best represented as dimensional constructs rather than kind of discrete categories with, you know, diagnoses assigned based on the presence or absence of really an arbitrary number of symptoms. Like I have antisocial PD on here. There's no real magic behind, you know, 3 versus 4 versus 2 number of symptoms to get that diagnosis. There's also quite a lot of variability in terms of presentation, even within diagnostic categories. So you think about borderline PD, it's quite possible to have two people with the same diagnostic label of borderline, and they only share one symptom among them. And so really what we're seeing and what we've shifted to doing is looking at PD through this kind of dimensional, unified model kind of lens, so to speak. The alternative model for personality disorders was published in the DSM-5 and republished in the DSM-5 TR. So it's been around within the DSM for a bit over around a decade or so, give or take. And this is a hybrid dimensional categorical model. And so the two main criteria that we're talking about really when we're talking about the AMPD is personality impairment. So this is really the kind of severity marker, kind of the core of personality psychopathology. I kind of sometimes talk about it as like, how bad is it? How bad are the problems that this person is dealing with related to their personality presentation? And then criterion B is a pathological trait model. I'll get into the details of both in a second, but really we're shifting to thinking about people as being placed on a continuum where they have kind of degrees of these constructs rather than kind of yes, no, they get the diagnosis or not. So we talk about criterion A, we're talking about intra and interpersonal functioning problems. So criterion A has 4 elements as part of it. Think about deficits in terms of, you know, identity, self-direction. You know, for example, I've worked with folks with really severe identity disturbance, and they really struggle to have kind of a stable, coherent, well-differentiated sense of self, even across days and weeks, so to speak. You know, if you're working in criminal legal settings, you probably think pretty regularly about empathy and intimacy deficits. So folks who really struggle to develop and maintain mutual relationships where there's kind of a two-way street, where folks are able to adopt other people's perspectives and have a desire for closeness. So again, criterion A is this impairment component where we're talking about kind of how severe is the personality pathology. In terms of criterion B, I don't unfortunately have time to get into all of the specifics. If you're familiar with the 5-factor model, the Big Five, Ocean, this is basically like the pathological version of that model. So in terms of negative affectivity, that is akin to neuroticism or emotional lability. Detachment is akin to extroversion. Antagonism is akin to agreeableness. Disinhibition is pretty strongly related to conscientiousness. Probably the only one of these that doesn't have a very clear match on the 5-factor model would probably be psychoticism. So it's somewhat related to openness to experience, but really this domain is meant to capture kind of the odd, eccentric, magical thinking, unusual beliefs, those kinds of things that for some folks presenting with PD, their PD might manifest in that kind of capacity. So, we have these 5 higher order domains, and then underneath those domains, we have 25 kind of narrow facets that fall under these domains. And so when we think about criterion A, I think we think about that as kind of a severity indicator, and then criterion B is kind of the flavor or the manifestation. What does this personality pathology look like? So when somebody has problems with empathy and intimacy, how might that kind of operate or manifest in an evaluation setting and their day-to-day life? So I talked about the AMPD as being this hybrid dimensional categorical model. And what I mean by that is that this model still retains the ability to diagnose somebody as having a personality disorder or not. So you're not losing the ability to diagnose somebody by using this model. You're just going about the diagnostic process in a bit of a different way, where we've kind of overlaid diagnostic categories on top of these dimensional constructs. And in many ways, the retention of these categorical labels provides kind of a nice bridge between the categorical system and really more of an evidence-based approach to thinking about PDs. The systems that we operate in really are quite reliant and use categories. I think about insurance companies, for example. They love diagnostic codes. And so from an AMPD lens, you're making these diagnoses based on the presence of personality impairment. So this person has to have some problems for you to pick up on as the evaluator. And then in terms of each of those specific diagnoses that are retained, each of those diagnostic profiles has a specific subset of those pathological facets from criterion B that map onto each of those diagnoses. So let's use antisocial PD as an example of this disorder that I imagine a lot of folks on this call are probably familiar with. So if you look at kind of the bottom set of bullet points here, to get a diagnosis, you need elevations on 6 of 7 pathological traits. And these facets are pulled across the antagonism and the disinhibition domains. So you have callousness listed here, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irresponsibility. I'll tell you, when I'm training students to use this model, what I usually find is that kind of the big barrier to learning this model is just getting familiar with this jargon and getting kind of used to the model, so to speak. There's a lot of complexity to this model upon kind of first glance, but once you get a handle on the language of this model, the structure of this model, and then in particular, the way the AMPD operationalizes these constructs, at least when I train students, they tend to pick up the model and start using it more readily once they have those things down. So, for example, I imagine most folks are familiar with talking about maybe examinees or clients as having difficulties with impulse control. Impulsivity is not a new concept. Callousness, being manipulative. These are not new concepts for folks, but the real difference is just the specific way it's operationalized within this model and the administration of new instruments and kind of a new research base surrounding this model. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of where we're at as in terms of the intersection of modern personality science and forensic assessment work. Dr. Abby Moulet and some colleagues, including myself, Abby published this paper very recently where she surveyed forensic evaluators in terms of their familiarity with dimensional models of personality disorders and psychopathology, and then whether or not they're actually using these models. And I think the results were pretty unsurprising. For a lot of folks, they've not heard of these models, or they've heard of them but don't know a whole lot about them. And among the folks who endorsed being aware of these models, very few folks are regularly using them in applied forensic work. And this is not really like a new problem for clinical psych. We have, for decades, as kind of a broader field, talked about this kind of disconnect between science and practice, and how do we take modern science and get it into the hands of folks who are working with people. And I use this quote from a paper I wrote with Dr. Tiffany Russell. She's a forensic psychologist, assistant professor up at University of North Dakota. And in this paper, we talk about sort of the AMPD in the context of violence risk assessment. She talks about like the Daubert standard and challenges to admissibility of the alternative model. But I think this quote kind of summarizes where we're at, which is at a broader level, personality assessment in forensic context is in an odd position where the traditional categorical approach persists in the most recent edition of the DSM, while the academic field is clearly shifting to dimensional conceptualizations of personality pathology. And so what we mean by that is that academics, we've spent a lot of time kind of debating, the proper structure of the model, whether we need both impairment and the pathological trait components, examining predictive validity, factor structure, all of these things, which are all important topics for us to consider and evaluate. But we haven't really done a particularly great job of providing tools for folks in the field. There's a number of case studies and some guides to assessment and treatment, but by and large, the vast majority of that work is really geared towards generalist settings and really doesn't take into account the unique context that forensic evaluators kind of operate in terms of the expectations and the demands that we have when we're doing these kinds of evaluations. And so I want to talk kind of about some of the big barriers that I see, kind of where we're at in terms of what data do we have to address these problems, or what data do we not have that we need, and then some practical solutions surrounding some of these problems. And I'll cover some of the main instruments that you might consider using if you're thinking about implementing AMPD-based assessment. So I think probably the biggest thing we need to tackle really is measuring the alternative model efficiently and scientifically. So I think the science component, most research on the AMPD is in more generalist settings. We do have a healthy and growing, but relatively small body of research on folks who are involved in the criminal legal system. But I think that efficiency component we've struggled with to a greater degree. So one big thing that I think we need more data surrounding is data connecting AMPD constructs with outcomes that forensic evaluators and the broader system we operate in actually care about. So, things like probation outcomes, institutional violence or institutional problems. We just need more data connecting AMPD instruments and constructs to outcomes and real world experiences that we care about. There is some data addressing some of these kinds of outcomes. So there's data, connecting AMPD constructs, particularly criterion B, to history of violence, PCLR scores. I'm working on a paper with Mark Boccassini. We just got a pretty positive revise and resubmit, linking AMPD scores to recidivism in a sample of individuals who are evaluated for SVP status. At least the results as they stand thus far is that these scores are modestly predictive, which is consistent with other kinds of self-report instruments in this area, but we really just need a whole lot more on this in a diverse array of populations and locations. We in particular are hurting for data on interview-based measures. We have some data that's pretty promising on inter-rater reliability of interview measures, but those data come from primarily generalist and/or laboratory settings. They're not coming from forensic evaluations, for example. And when I think about using interview-based measures, I use the PCLR pretty regularly, and I can think of a number of studies that are documenting debates around the appropriateness of the PCLR data, surrounding kind of the impact of bias on PCLR scores. And there's really a healthy body of literature for you to draw upon to help you think through limitations and problems and strengths of that instrument as one example. But in terms of interview-based measures of the AMPD, as far as I know of at least, we don't have any data documenting kind of whether there are, inter-rater reliability problems taking these interview measures into forensic evals. I think about, Mark Marcassini and Dan Murray's work on adversarial allegiance, evidence that, who retains you influences how you score instruments. And I would imagine that the AMPD interview measures are probably going to have somewhat similar problems, but I don't have any data to support that. I don't know of any data documenting kind of how bad or how minimal that problem might be if it exists. So we really are hurting for data on interview-based measures in applied forensic settings. In terms of instruments that you might consider using, I use the level of personality functioning scale, not so much when I'm doing forensic evals, but when I'm training students. So in case you're somebody who's thinking about, training people on this model, the level of personality functioning scale is already in the DSM. So if you flip back to section 3, this is just like a clinician rated measure that's readily available if you have a DSM. And so you're going to be rating the individual you're seeing based on kind of the sum of interview information you've collected. I find when I'm working with students, this is a really helpful tool because basically after they do their intake or initial set of interviews, they can sit with the DSM and kind of operationalize in a concrete fashion where somebody falls on the criterion A component of the alternative model. The LPFS self-report, Les Morey published this getting close to about a decade ago. This is an 80-item self-report measure. I know folks are working on an abbreviated version of it. I highlight this instrument because it seems to work pretty well, but it's also an instrument that directly maps onto the way criterion A is discussed and operationalized in the DSM. There's a lot of criterion A measures, which is a little bit different from the criterion B pathological trait model. And there are certainly other really well-used and well-supported criterion A self-report instruments. I use the LPFS BF 2.0 pretty regularly in generalist settings. It's a brief 12-item instrument I use quite regularly in terms of like therapy tracking. It's pretty easy to administer week by week. And the items I think are really clinically relevant. Probably the instrument with the most scientific support surrounding it is the PID-5, the Personality Inventory for DSM-5. It is a 220-item self-report measure. It is also freely available. If you Google this instrument, it'll come up for you with how you score it and all of that. This is probably where we've seen most AMPD research focusing on. And so there's probably more criterion B literature out there compared to criterion A, probably at least in part because this criterion B measure was around before some of the self-report criterion A measures were. So this is going to give you really rich, detailed criterion B information. It's probably not terribly practical if I think about administering or doing like a clinical interview plus administering a semi-structured interview, plus a PAI or MMPI, adding on a 220-item instrument is probably not the most feasible thing for me in terms of the time crunch I have, as well as just kind of like the frustration tolerance and willingness to fill out lengthy questionnaires of folks that I'm evaluating. The brief form is 25 items, which is really useful as a screener instrument. It's going to give you good data on kind of those 5 higher order domains. And some folks have used it as a screener in the sense that if folks score 2 or higher on average on one of those domains, they're flagged for follow-up, more detailed personality assessment work. There's also the faceted brief form. There is less data probably on the faceted brief form than the overall, the original PID-5. But in terms of like clinically rich information that is also feasible, in terms of implementation, this is probably going to be the most compelling version, I'd say, of the Criterion B self-report instruments, particularly the PID-5. It's 100 items, 20. It gives you rich information on both the facets and those domains, and 100 items isn't too bad. I do want to highlight with the PID-5, there is a recent instrument manual that's available to you. That's been published. I purchased it myself, and I really like it a lot. It gives you really brief, easy to digest summaries of the literature addressing different components of the AMPD and the PID-5. And so if you're interested in using a PID-5 in your applied work, I'd really highly recommend the manual. There are norms available, so you can place somebody's scores in the context of community samples. And then there are validity scales for the PID-5, which is another important piece when we think about taking the AMPD into applied forensic work. So I've highlighted this over-reporting scale. There's also a careless responding scale that's built in to the PID-5. And so, that certainly doesn't fully address validity concerns, but it's certainly a good set of progress in terms of getting us where we need to go. And the existing evidence on these scales suggests they work pretty well. All right. I also want to talk a little bit about the PAI and the MMPI. Full disclosure, I'm more of a PAI person than an MMPI person. So you're going to get better MMPI information from somebody out of the MMPI family. I do want to highlight kind of that if you're already using a PAI or an MMPI in your applied work, then you're actually already collecting AMPD information, regardless of whether you're framing that information in an AMPD kind of fashion. So in terms of the PAI plus report is available, and that gives you norm reference scores for both Criterion A and Criterion B. Criterion A, it's a global indicator, so it doesn't tell you element-specific information like empathy or intimacy, but it does give you kind of an overall snapshot of kind of how severe their pathology is. And then the pathological trait model, it gives you the 5 overarching factors and then the 25 facets. There's not a whole lot of research on these scores. I've published on it with clinical settings with colleagues of mine from Massachusetts General Hospital. And then that paper I mentioned with Mark Boccassini, the AMPD scores are derived from the PAI. So, you're getting really clinically rich information, but those data do not have like a really large forensic research base surrounding them. So, I would recommend using them kind of tentatively, so to speak. In terms of the MMPI-3, there's quite a lot of research on the Psi-5. Those scales align with the overarching Criterion B domain, so negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, psychoticism, and there's like a pretty large research base surrounding them, supporting their utility and psychometric properties. And so you kind of have this exchange happening here where a pro of the MMPI-3 is that you're getting probably more empirical evidence surrounding the AMPD scores it offers, but you're not getting the same level of detailed AMPD information as you would with a PAI, which is just kind of where we're at with that. I do want to highlight one set of interviews for the AMPD. There are other interviews that exist that have evidence base surrounding them. I tend to use SCID-based interviews pretty regularly in clinical training and clinical work. So there are SCID interviews available for Criterion A, personality impairment, and Criterion B, the pathological traits. I've bolded this module 3 here because I think this is probably the more compelling module out of the 3 for forensic evaluators. I think one of the tensions between implementing the AMPD in the context of a forensic eval setting is that the AMPD is a comprehensive model. And we really, when we're assessing personality pathology and forensic evals, we want to be assessing the constructs that are specifically relevant to the referral question that we are being asked to address. And so, I'd worry a little bit about doing a comprehensive AMPD assessment and introducing probably a bunch of cool AMPD information that may be distracting or stigmatizing or prejudicial, that doesn't actually address what I'm being asked to address. With module 3, if you think about those 10 diagnostic categories I was discussing earlier, this module has interviews, semi-structured interviews for criterion A and criterion B, specific to each of those diagnostic categories. So for example, there's an antisocial PD interview in there that allows you to assess criterion A as it relates to antisocial PD, and then the facets that are specifically relevant to antisocial PD. And so outside of just, being specific about what you're addressing, this also kind of offers a bit more of a efficient use of time, perhaps, in that you're not doing a full assessment that might take a fair amount longer. All right, I think this is an area that we're struggling in, but it's getting better. I in terms of my perspective, at least, which is we need more kind of applied resources and tools to help folks think through how they might decide to write about the AMPD evidence, how they might communicate about the AMPD, and sort of like, why might you use it? What psycholegal questions can this model help me address? And I think this is an area that we've been lacking in terms of the scientists working with practitioners and scientist practitioners generating this kind of content. I think it's getting better, but we're still not quite there. I think, for example, it'd be great to see more books. I find those to be a pretty accessible way to catch up on science, and then more articles that talk through kind of case examples that are specific to forensic settings. And just a shout out, Abby Mulagan, she published this paper with some colleagues talking about how the AMP kind of applies to, my memory serves correctly, a threat assessment case. All right, another barrier, another angle to think about with this is how you might actually use the AMPD within the criminal legal system. So I always think about the tension between the legal system is pretty clearly categorical, guilty or not. All of those things are pretty categorical. But we're talking about a dimensional model where we're talking about degrees of things, and talking to an attorney or a judge about, like, yeah, this guy's like kind of antisocial, he's moderately antisocial. I think a lot of folks will go, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be moderately antisocial? And we need more applied work addressing how you might communicate dimensional models, as well as more science supporting different ways to talk about these models. So, for example, I'm working on a manuscript right now looking at kind of traditional PCLR testimony pitted against the alternative model's antisocial PD testimony, and seeing if mock jurors differ in terms of their perceptions of these models. In terms of the decision making, at least the preliminary analyses we've ran, they look relatively similar, and the mock jurors in the study indicated they understood the AMPD model similar to the PCLR testimony. And I'm working on a number of other collaborations on this specific area with Dr. Daniela Cash, Dr. Emmy Wood, and Dr. Tiffany Russell. But we really need a healthier body of literature addressing kind of how to get the ball rolling on this. I think also for a lot of folks, there are concerns about like whether the AMPD will be challenged in court, and understandably. I'm highlighting this paper that Dr. Russell and I wrote. She took the lead on most of the Daubert stuff. We talk in detail about kind of whether the AMPD can withstand challenges. We think it's doing pretty well. In particular, I think we're really at the place where the AMPD is probably a useful supplement to what you're already doing. I don't know if I view the AMPD, well, I don't. I don't view the AMPD right now as kind of ready for prime time, replacing the traditional kind of categorical model work that you're probably doing. I think there's also another component to this, which is we need to develop a body of literature and a body of work helping people think about how to train their supervisees on this model. So I pulled this quote from a paper that was published a few years ago on evidence-based clinical psychological assessment. And one of the recommendations or points from this paper was that we should be training our students to assess people and think about people from both a traditional categorical system as well as a dimensional system, largely because the categorical system is still the norm. Insurance companies, folks from other disciplines, they are used to using categorical diagnoses. But there is kind of this growing expectation from the assessment field, the personality assessment field, that we start training folks to, at the very least, start thinking about people using these dimensional models. And I don't really know of a whole lot that specifically addresses this concern. There's some data suggesting that these models are not terribly hard to learn, that once you have some lectures on it and get familiar with these instruments and these models, it's not terribly hard to learn. But that's all been, from my memory, and maybe I'm missing something, that's all been in the context of kind of generalist work. We also need a lot more work examining the AMPD in the context of people's real world lived experiences, particularly connecting AMPD scores and how to make sense of them in the context of different sociocultural factors and cultural identities, experiences of marginalization, particularly given in forensic settings, a number of marginalized populations are pretty heavily overrepresented in the criminal legal system. And we just don't have enough literature addressing this particular concern. In particular, we don't have a whole lot of literature helping practitioners kind of disentangle these things in real world cases. All right, I want to kind of talk through a sexually violent predator eval I did. This is kind of an amalgamation of a couple of cases and then some things I also made up, and kind of walk you through how I might think about using the AMPD in this kind of work. I want to be clear that this is how I think about using the AMPD. I'm not suggesting that this is the right or the only way to do that. This is just the way that I've been thinking about it, which, take that for what it's worth. So Mr. A is a 55-year-old white man. He's serving a 20-year sentence for aggravated sexual assault of a child. He has a prior conviction for indecency with a child conviction, similar victim profile. In terms of the current legal circumstances, he was essentially found molesting his nephew. His sister, the kid's mom, found him and reported him to police, and he was picked up pretty soon after that. He has a criminal history involving a misdemeanor possession. He had like a brief probation that he successfully completed. And then he also had a burglary of vehicle conviction. He received probation for 5 years, and then he violated that probation with the current set of legal circumstances. And again, this is just a snapshot of kind of his history. In terms of his childhood development, his grandma primarily raised him starting about 8 years old for him. He described his grandmother as a saint who put up with a lot. Described her as caring, but very firm with him. I think her health, from what he was telling me, her health was kind of failing in later years. And as he kind of reached teenage years, she just wasn't quite as with it, and wasn't able to monitor him probably as much as he reports needing. He described being raised by his mom sort of in the early years of his life. His mother was in and out of his life. She was responsible for raising him, but she would regularly leave him at home, and he described her as having like pretty notable substance use issues. He described being exposed to intimate partner violence. He said that some of the men that she dated would physically abuse her, and at times they would also physically abuse him. He had some really heartbreaking stories about, her partners abusing him physically, and his mom kind of being really not having a whole lot of feelings about that, and being still quite hurt about that. At one point, essentially, a neighbor called for intimate partner violence, and CPS got involved, and he got picked up and placed with grandma. He claimed to have kind of settled down, but also talked about a lot of things suggesting that he didn't really settle down a whole lot. it sounds like when he got picked up and placed with grandma, there was like a relative period of calm, and then some behavioral issues started emerging a couple years later. He described getting in regular fights. He described just being kind of like a hot-headed kid, and that as time went on, as he got older, he actually just kind of enjoyed the fights. So sometimes he'd pick the fights. He did describe himself as picking the fights. Sometimes he picked the fights because he was irritated with the other kids. Other times he just thought it was fun. And then he transferred schools, was placed in kind of an alternative program because he threw a large metal chair at a teacher and it hit the teacher. He claims to have mellowed out in his teenage years, but it doesn't really sound like it entirely. It sounds like he was still having a number of behavioral issues, described setting fires to things, staying out way past when he was allowed, vandalism, all sorts of stuff. In particular, he described kind of a notable substance use history. He started drinking at age 10 years old. It sounds like he got involved with some older kids who kind of manipulated him into getting alcohol from his grandma's place. He got to hang out with them because he was bringing them alcohol. He started experimenting with marijuana and LSD at about 14 years old. And when he reached his early 20s, started using cocaine. He described it as sporadic use, and then it started increasing to much more frequent use around the same time as the burglary conviction. So in terms of his institutional behavior, I evaluated him a couple years outside of his 20-year conviction sentence. There were a number of reports of physical fights with other inmates. When I asked about it, he described it as sometimes self-defense, sometimes he was bored and would just start fights because there was nothing else to do. And then he also had a number of sexual misconduct write-ups. They were all for public masturbation. And from the correctional officer's notes, it sounds like he'd be caught. They'd ask him to stop and he would just continue. When I asked him about it, he essentially conveyed that he was aroused by being caught. And that was part of his arousal for him. So in terms of Texas SVP evals, so evaluate him for a behavioral abnormality, which is essentially kind of like a mental health problem that makes him more likely to perpetrate a new sexual offense. So I'm evaluating him as well for risk for sexual recidivism. Texas requires assessment of psychopathy. So usually I'm asked to collect data to score a PCLR. And I think this is really where the AMPD can be used in this kind of context. So I think about using the AMPD in the context of kind of multi-method psychopathy assessment, essentially. So in terms of the PAI, I usually get as part of the referral a PAI that's relatively recent that they've completed. And so I'm getting the antisocial scales that are original to the PAI, as well as those AMPD instruments. And then I'm assessing PCLR using assessing psychopathy using the PCLR. And then I am also administering this 80 item self-report criterion A instrument. And part of that is to kind of complement what the PAI gives me. The PAI gives me a pretty rich criterion B trait profile, but I don't really get a whole lot of detailed criterion A information. And so I'm using this additional self-report to kind of supplement what I already have. There were surprisingly no validity concerns for this profile. I pretty regularly get folks who are pretty clearly engaging in positive impression management. So PIM is usually at least somewhat elevated. There's no validity indicators within the LPFS SR. So I would be using the PAI, the validity scales there to help me filter out whether the LPFSR can be interpreted in any meaningful capacity. And then on top of what I'm getting from the self-report data, I'm also collecting data for the PCLR. Gotta tell you, he was really charming in this interview. It felt like I was wrestling control for the interview pretty regularly. Definitely kind of jailhouse lawyer talk, superficial charm, callous, all those things. And then of course, factor 2 also, he had some scores on factor 2 that reflect difficulties with impulse control and a history of getting in trouble. So taken together, based on the manual, he'd be characterized as high psychopathy from the PCLR manual, not quite the 30 cutoff, but in terms of those diagnostic, for those labels in the PCLR manual, that qualifies as a high psychopathy. In terms of the PAI, these are the original PAI scales. He's elevating all three of them, which is not shocking. He's reporting getting in trouble with the legal system. He's reporting kind of in a self-serving approach to other people, where he is willing to exploit other people. And in the interview, he said things that can align pretty well with this. All of us are self-serving, and anybody who's telling you anything differently is lying to you and wants something from you. He endorsed boredom proneness and needing to do something at all times. So this was not shocking. I honestly thought these scores would be a little bit higher, to be frank. In terms of the antisocial PD scores, I'm specifically focusing on those facets that are relevant to the antisocial PD diagnostic label from the AMPD. He is elevating most of the antagonism facets, manipulativeness, callousness, deceitfulness, not terribly shocking. Again, this all sort of aligns with what he's been telling me in the interview, to be frank. And then also he's elevating the disinhibition facets as well. So, I think about irresponsibility reflecting kind of difficulties following through upon agreements or honoring obligations. He certainly has a history of that. For example, he violated probation pretty early on, only 2 years into his probation duration. There is what's called the psychopathy specifier in the alternative model. This is pretty hotly debated. I don't tend to use this as often. The idea with the psychopathy specifier is that it's meant to reflect kind of a fearlessness and a socially dominant interpersonal style. There's a lot of debate surrounding whether these specific facets, low anxiousness, low withdrawal, high attention seeking, whether that properly reflects that construct. If this is an area that interests you, Dr. Jamie Anderson and Dr. Shannon Kelly wrote a really excellent review article, I think 2 years old or so, that summarizes the literature and kind of where we're at with that. From this perspective, he would qualify for this psychopathy specifier as well. From the LPFS-SR, there is no normative data set for the LPFS-SR, so I'm placing his scores in the context of the original development sample. And he's scoring average for the intrapersonal elements, but elevations on empathy and intimacy deficits. So really, I'm getting this kind of multi-method characterization of this guy as struggling to develop meaningful, healthy relationships with other people. That's coming across in PCLR scores, clinical interview data, the PAI scores, the LPFS-SR scores. So not terribly shocking. So in terms of the write-up consideration, this is sort of how I think through writing up these kinds of results, which again, isn't necessarily a way that fits what you think would be most appropriate for your particular circumstances. So I usually will outline kind of the diagnostic criteria across section 2 and section 3, and I'll try to tie together the data that I collected to how these models are laid out in the DSM and making cases for why I think he qualifies for certain symptoms or elevations for certain traits. I will think about kind of like writing an integrated summary, kind of like what does this mean? What does it mean for him to qualify for these diagnoses? Why does this matter? And then tying that into the referral question. So I think about psychopathy in the context of meta-analytic work, linking an antisocial orientation to risk for sexual recidivism, and essentially making the case of, do I think high psychopathy is present or not as a risk factor? In this case, my summary statement was, yeah, I think this guy is presenting with higher levels of psychopathy. In terms of kind of the outcome for this, so I used the static 99R and a stable. Those combined scores suggested high risk, that he was above average risk. And then in terms of the behavioral abnormality component of this, I ended up giving him a pedophilia diagnosis, not just because he had a history of offenses against children, but he was, for whatever reason, very forthcoming in this interview. At times he'd present these like objectively kind of negative components about himself that he would kind of defend as like he's fighting the good fight. And although he has these struggles, he's like a noble person for struggling against them. And he like pretty point blank, after some pressing, told me that he is still sexually aroused when he thinks about or sees children. He specifically referenced if children ever appear on TV in the prison at all. He pretty much blatantly told me that he still has this. That was sort of the outcome of this case and how I kind of think about writing that up. If I were to kind of summarize kind of, the major takeaways for this presentation, if you could walk away with three things. One, I do think the AMPD is probably defensible empirically. Abby Millay pointed out this case where the AMPD was admitted into the courtroom and the judge kind of talks about why it was admitted. I think the data are just pretty clear at this point. The PD field is really just not, we're not debating whether categories or dimensions are superior at this point. We are all, by and large, for the most part, falling on the side that dimensions are probably better than categories, at least where the data stand right now. And of course, new data could potentially change that, but that's sort of where the field is at right now. I think in terms of practical suggestions, I think I would be comfortable. I think I'm comfortable using the AMPD as a supplement to what I'm already doing, but I would not argue that you should throw out what you're already doing and just replace that with the AMPD. This literature is still kind of nascent when it comes to forensic work. We have a lot more data we need and a lot more things to vet, I think. But I think right now using it as kind of this supplemental approach can be quite helpful. So, when I'm writing up psychopathy evidence, I'm still weighting the PCLR more heavily than I am AMPD evidence. And that's because the PCLR has quite a lot more research surrounding strengths and limitations and debates surrounding that instrument. And at the very least, I think becoming familiar with the AMPD is going to help you in the long term. Dimensions are just inevitable. That's where the science is heading, and we're just not studying categories anymore in the same way that we were 25 years ago or so, or 15 years ago. And so I'd really advocate for, at the very least, reading up on this model and getting familiar with it so you can kind of stay on track of this model as the literature evolves. I've included a number of references here that I hope are helpful. A couple of highlights, I think, are some recent papers talking about using the MMPI-3 and the PAI in applied settings. Abby Moulet's paper on the AMPD with in the context of threat assessment, and then some other papers that I think might be helpful. Thanks for having me. This is the QR code, and I think we have for CE, and then I think we have time for questions, if that's all right.
We do have some time for questions, and yes, thank you so much, Jared, Dr. Ruchensky, for all your approaches here. Of course, your work in this area, I definitely resonate with the idea of these kind of forced categorizations out of tradition and practice, and not really lining up with what we see in forensic or in general clinical evaluations, for that matter. Thank you also for helping us see it as well with this case summation. We do have a number of questions so far in the chat. We'll get to a couple of them before we wrap up. The QR code is up here for those that are interested in the APA survey for CEU credits, and there is now a link in the chat box that includes that as well. Somebody had asked about, they had found some research on the PID-5 for inconsistency and over-reporting scales. They had found a citation for an under-reporting scale, but had been unable to find the scale or an article about it, other than some citation that said such an article was in press, and they couldn't find that. Do you have any information on the PID-5 under-reporting scale, or where any info?
Honestly, Abby might. She's good at finding that kind of stuff. I'll see if I can't find it, and if not, I'll text or email Abby and ask if she has it offhand. She's talked about that instrument before, or that scale before, which is why it's coming to mind.
All right, thank you for that. Is there a computer scoring or spreadsheet available for the PID-5?
Yep. Yeah. So I'm trying to think. I think Lynham and I think Bryant have I'm blinking all the authors' names, so forgive me if you're on this paper. They have an Excel spreadsheet that's a supplement. I think Josh Miller published some norms within the supplemental materials. I think they either have a link to or within supplemental materials themselves an Excel spreadsheet where you can like enter in somebody's raw item scores and it'll just like generate a profile for you. I think there's also a companion website. Again, don't quote me on this, but I think there's a companion website for the manual that also generates like a computerized report. So I think there are some options for folks if they're interested in that kind of document.
Wonderful, thank you. This was about 20 minutes in, so it's in reference to some of the earlier work you were talking about regarding predicting SVP recidivism. Someone was asking, in those early studies you mentioned, did you use informant ratings when predicting SVP recidivism?
I have not, no, and I don't. I know Dustin Wygant has had some data using. I'm pretty sure, unless I'm misremembering these. This is the study I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of a table with a very complicated matrix in it. I know Dustin Wygant has published a little bit on informant rated, but in terms of like applied forensic correctional work, by and large, there's not a whole lot of data on informant work, and certainly in the SVP paper I'm talking about, I don't have any informant data on.
If somebody were to want to seek more training in AMPD, do you know of particular places or references that are accessible to getting more professional training in the model specifically?
I think right now where we're at is we're doing more of these online presentations. I did one for PAR. I know some other folks have done other trainings. I think Jamie Anderson was here a few weeks ago, to be honest with you.
Yes.
So I think these online presentations are getting a little bit more attention. I know some folks have books they're working on, I believe. And so I would look for books coming out. And I think the books are probably going to be the most digestible format for that. And then I would say at APLS, I would say at Society for Personality Assessment, that annual conference, there's usually some workshops surrounding using the AMPD in applied work. So I think there are some in-person workshops that are available for applied use.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I can't recall now if it was during the Q&A here or in a side chat before the webinar started, but when Jamie Anderson was on here earlier, she was referencing similarly that a lot more of the webinars and presentations have been more in Society of Personality Assessment conference stuff than say Psych Law, APLS kind of conferences. It tends to be more in the personality assessment area specifically right now.
Yeah.
You mentioned books there. I guess a subtle angle here. Somebody thanking you for the presentation. It's been great. They teach personality disorders and abnormal psychology and work in a forensic setting. I was wondering if you have any recommendations for textbooks that may explore dimensional models of personality.
Yes. So Abby Millay, Christopher Hopwood, and one other person. I think his last name Waugh. I apologize for. I hope I'm not misspelling that, but they have a book on AMPD assessment. I find it really digestible. When I'm training students on the AMPD, they have some case example chapters that I assign students to read, and I find that to be a really digestible kind of entry point. I don't think it has a whole lot. It's been a while since I've read that. I don't think it has a whole lot that's specifically tied to forensic work per se. But in terms of getting access to AMPD info, I think that'd be a good starting point.
Wonderful, thank you. And then one final question, since we are at the top of the hour now. Somebody did ask, how do you fold information about ACEs and early traumatic experiences and psychosis in your evaluations? There are examples, especially from those of other cultures and on death row. I guess a lot of intersections here. But I guess in particular, that broad aspect, how do you fold info of ACEs and early traumatic experiences, psychosis in these evaluations, I guess with this model in mind?
I don't know if I have like a broad, like this is how I typically do it. I mean, really what we're talking about is like personalizing the assessment. So like a good evaluation is going to place those scores and those constructs in that person's lived experience. And, I'm always thinking about trying to avoid pathologizing, things like experiences of discrimination or other forms of marginalization. So when I think about like criterion A, difficulties getting along with people, I don't want to pathologize somebody for experiences that don't reflect PD, but just kind of reflect their lived experiences. So, I'm looking for, impairment and those kinds of things across settings that are very clearly not specific to that person's like ACEs or other kinds of experiences like that.
Well, Dr. Ruchensky, Jared, thank you so much for sharing your expertise here with us today. I think this was a really eye-opening talk about just thinking about conceptualizing and the work that we do with the people that we evaluate, whether it's in a forensic setting, but even just zooming out and thinking about the experiences of the person we interview and how we can understand personality and interpersonal functioning from a more dimensional perspective. So
Sure,
thank you
thanks for
so
having
much
me.
for all your work there. Absolutely. And that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, we have Dr. Catherine Shaper-McCouche, who will be discussing risk assessment for interpartner violence, stalking, and gang violence among adolescents. And that will be our final LMH talk for 2024 before we resume again in January 2025. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.